In our last study, we began our discussion of the epistolary greeting of the book of Revelation, and that was chapter 1, verses 4 and 5a. So I'm just going to read the entire passage again, and then we'll pick up where we left off. It reads, "John, to the 7 churches that are in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you from he who is, and who was, and who is still to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from among the dead, the ruler over the kings of the earth." In our last study, we identified the 3 elements of a customary epistolary greeting, and then we discussed grace and peace, how that's a distinctively Christian greeting, and the reasons for that. But in this study, we're going to focus on the phrase, he who is, and who was, and who is still to come. Because the grace and peace, that's the first source of the grace and peace. Grace and peace to you from he who is. Now the phrase he who is very anomalous grammar in the Greek. And scholars call this a grammatical solecism, which means a phrase that transgresses the rules of grammar. And we talked about those in our introductory, one of our introductory teachings on the book of Revelation, how John uses this improper grammar, this anomalous grammar, or these solecisms in order to point to the Old Testament. And Thomas Schreiner says, quote, "The grammatical solecism is almost certainly intentional," end quote. Now he said almost certainly. I think it's definitely intentional. Now this is one of the places where John is intentionally using awkward or anomalous grammar, a solecism, to point us to the Old Testament. John is quoting the Septuagint of Exodus 3:14. And as we discussed in our introductory series of teachings, John never uses any of the standard methods of quotation when he's referring to the Old Testament. He never says, "it is written," or "as the scriptures say," or anything similar to that, which is the normal way that the New Testament authors alert us that they're quoting the Old Testament. To fulfill the scriptures or something like that, but John never does that in the book of Revelation. What he does is he uses these Greek anomalies, these solecisms, and that's how he draws the attention of the reader and the hearer to the Old Testament. That's how he alerts us that he is going to the Old Testament for what follows. And some scholars call this Semitic Greek or Septuagintalisms that John is using. But the more general term is solecism, so I'll probably use that more often. And the net scholars, they have a note on this, as do all the scholars. I mean, they all notice this, and so they're all going to comment on it. And the net scholars say, quote, "The passage appears to be an allusion to Exodus 3:14 in the Septuagint, where God refers to himself as he who is. The same Greek wording as here in Revelation 1:4. Thus, it appears that John is wanting to leave the divine name untouched, perhaps as a pointer to the Old Testament as the key to unlocking the meaning of this book, irrespective of what it looks like grammatically," end quote. Now, I do want to point out, because I notice it as I read more and more academic material, scholars will always do things like, as if you noticed in what the net said, this passage appears to be an allusion to Exodus 3:14. It appears that John is wanting to do, so forth and so on. Or as Schreiner said, the solecism is almost certainly intentional. They always put these little caveats just in case they're wrong. I find that interesting. But I do notice it. The more I read academic material, they all tend to do that. That's just a point out something that I've noticed, where that's not really relevant to what we're talking about here. But David Aune, he also comments on this, and you'll notice he uses this same kind of language. He says, quote, "Just as Moses was told to accredit his message by telling the people that he who is had sent him, so John appears to be authenticating his prophetic book by claiming that its actual source is none other than he who is. He who is understood by Philo as the divine name that Moses as a prophet used to authenticate his message," end quote. So to the people of the time, that title, he who is, immediately takes their minds to Yahweh, the divine name that was revealed to Moses, that Moses was supposed to go and tell the people, the one who sent him is he who is. So because of the familiarity of the people of the time with the Septuagint, they would have known when John said he who is, oh, he's quoting Septuagint, he's quoting the divine name, he's talking about Yahweh. So for John, the theological message takes precedent over the niceties of proper grammar. As Coaster notes, Craig Coaster, quote, he makes God seem absolute above the normal constraints of Greek grammar, end quote. But some scholars who have a lower view of John, who have a lower view of the scriptures, they see these solecisms and they think that it shows that John didn't know how to properly write Greek, that they're not intentional errors, they're just ignorant errors or untaught, untrained, that John was not learned enough to write Greek, and so they're just errors. So that's what some scholars believe. But as Greg Beale notes, quote, it would be a blunder of modern thinking to judge this as a mistake of one who did not know his Greek very well. Here, as elsewhere, commentators generally acknowledge that the incorrect grammar is intentional. End quote. And Beale goes further. I have a little bit more of this quote. He says, furthermore, the full threefold phrase may have become a general title for God in Judaism, end quote. And what he's talking about there, the full threefold phrase is he who is and who was and who is still to come. And the net scholars say this expression is, quote, quite extraordinary. It may be an interpretation of the name Yahweh already current, or an attempt to show reverence for the divine name by preserving it unchanged, end quote. So they're saying the same thing as Beale there with the statement that it's how they would recognize Yahweh at that time. The interpretation of the name Yahweh in Judaism at that time may have been to understand him as he who is and who was and who is still to come. And this, I believe, comes from the Targums, which we'll look at here in a second. But there's a scholar named Sean McDonough who wrote a book called Yahweh at Patmos. And I don't have this book yet, but Schreiner interacts with it a fair amount. And I thought it was very interesting, so I'm going to bring some of this book in, but it's through the discussion that Schreiner has with the book, because I have not read the book myself. But according to Schreiner's interaction with McDonough, he says that McDonough argues that the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew of Exodus 3:14 is not a distortion, that McDonough sees the wording as philosophical. God is the ever-existent one, the one who is and who always was, and as the ever-living one, he transcends time. Now, I was not expecting to find a philosophical discussion, even a brief one, in Schreiner's interaction with McDonough. I was not expecting to see the philosophical ideas of God and time show up in a commentary on the book of Revelation. I thought that was very interesting, as that's an area that I personally find fascinating. And I listened to the interviews with the Christian philosophers, R.T. Mullins, William Lane Craig, as they discuss this issue. And I am by no means competent enough in this field to offer any kind of critique on McDonough's statement here about the phrase in Exodus 3:14 being philosophical and indicating that God transcends time. But the phrase does seem to be a temporal statement. He who is would indicate present tense, he who was past tense, and he who is still to come future tense. So it seems to be a temporal statement, and one that the philosophers that discuss time do bring up. But I thought it was fascinating to see that in a commentary of the book of Revelation. McDonough further argues that this philosophy from the Septuagint of Exodus 3:14 is not owing to or dependent upon Platonic philosophy, even if it does interact with it. So at the time, the Jews would have been familiar with the philosophy of the Greeks, and McDonough is arguing that even though they were aware of the Platonic philosophy because they were at that time immersed in the Greek culture. He's arguing that Exodus 3:14 does not owe the philosophical content to Platonism, nor is it dependent upon it. So that's also very interesting, that McDonough's argument is that this philosophy stands on its own. The Jews didn't get this idea from Platonic philosophy, nor do they depend on it for their understanding of Yahweh. That's McDonough's argument. It's very interesting. And Schreiner, again, discussing or interacting with McDonough, he makes a statement in there that Exodus 3:14 is communicating an ontological or metaphysical meaning. Now, I'm not going to go into that again. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not anywhere near competent enough in that field to discuss this further, but for those of you who are, there you go. It's a very fascinating topic, definitely worthy of further study for the people who are more philosophical in their analysis of certain passages of Scripture. But now let's get back to this threefold phrase and its use in the Targums, because the Targums also pick this up. Specifically, the Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan from Deuteronomy 32 verse 39 says, "I am he who is and who was, and I am he who will be, and there is no other God besides me." Now, what's fascinating about that passage in the Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan is that it's the Memra, the Word, the second power in heaven, who is speaking in that verse of Deuteronomy 32. So we know that the Word was made flesh, and some have argued that John gets his word theology from the Memra, from the Targums, and that the second power in heaven, the Memra, the fact that he's the one speaking in Deuteronomy 32:39 shows that is, when you overlay the Gospel of John, what they call Johannine theology, the theology of John, when you overlay that on top of the Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan 32:39, you see that the one who is speaking, at least according to John, how John would be reading that, the one who spoke Deuteronomy 32:39 would have been the pre-incarnate Jesus. So you see the pre-incarnate Jesus, the second power in heaven, saying, "I am he who is and who was, and I am he who will be." So he's claiming to be Yahweh. And that's how I believe John would have read that in Deuteronomy 32:39, saying that the pre-incarnate Jesus, the Word who was God, is Yahweh. So I think that also is very interesting, very important when we see John and how he takes and how he seems to be reading these Targums and how they lead him to a very high Christology, how he clearly draws the divinity of Jesus out of these type of passages in the Targums. Again, because this Targum has the pre-incarnate Christ, the pre-incarnate Jesus saying, "I am he who is and who was, and I am he who will be," which, as we've just been discussing, is how the Jews of the time viewed Yahweh. That was how they identified Yahweh. So here we see the second power in heaven, who became incarnate in Christ, saying that exact phrase. So again, the second power, Jesus, is God. Greg Beale, he says, quote, "In Revelation, the last part of the threefold clause, which is who is still to come, this is to be understood eschatologically and as referring to God's sovereign consummation of history in the future," end quote. And this threefold formula is also found in Revelation 1:8 and 4:8. But in chapter 11, verse 17, and chapter 16, verse 5, we see the one who is and the one who was. And that's all we see there. It goes from 3 to 2. And the reason for that is because the one who is still to come is not mentioned in those verses, because at that time, when we get to chapter 11 and then 16, the one who is to come is coming. So the return is being wrapped up. The consummation of history, that, as Beale calls it, is happening in real time in chapter 11 and 16. So that is why some of the scholars believe that it changes from the threefold phrase to the twofold when we get later in the book of Revelation, because the consummation of history is happening at the time when those phrases are being used. So we'll look into that further when we get to chapter 11 and chapter 16. But Schreiner also comments on this, and he comments on it again through McDonough. He says, quote, McDonough points out that in the New Testament, God will come when Jesus Christ returns. The coming in Revelation 1:4 is the coming of God. But McDonough rightly says that the definition of who God is cannot be separated from Jesus Christ. God is defined as the one who is to come, but this coming is in the person of Christ. We have an indication here of the inseparable operations of the persons of the Trinity, end quote. So that is very interesting and also very important, that scholars are also seeing in this threefold phrase the Trinity. And David Aune says, quote, syntactically, three distinct entities could be represented here, yet semantically it is clear that all three noun clauses represent God, end quote. So there's the Trinity being communicated here in the Greek grammar of Revelation 1:4. And the early church also saw the Trinity in this phrase. Andrew of Caesarea said, quote, and therefore he makes mention of 7 angels and 7 churches, to which he says, grace to you and peace from the tri-hypostatic deity. Through the phrase who is, the Father is indicated, who spoke to Moses, I am who I am. Through the phrase who was, the Word is indicated, who was in the beginning with God. And through the phrase who is to come, the Paraclete is indicated, end quote. So that's also very interesting that the early church was also making these same conclusions as they were studying the book of Revelation. And as we close this study, we're going to talk now a bit about how the pagans understood this phrase. As Beale and others, and all the scholars notice this, and they all comment on it. I just have the quote from Beale, but he's definitely not alone in what he's going to say here. He says, quote, a similar threefold formula is found in pagan Greek literature as a title of the gods, which may have sparked John's appeal to the Jewish formulas as an apologetic, end quote. So as I said, all the scholars notice that this threefold formula is found in the Greek literature and is used for the pagan gods. But what I really think is a good point there is that Beale's statement that John might be using the threefold formula in addition to highlighting Exodus chapter 3, he's using it also to slap at the pagans. He's using it as an apologetic. So we're going to look at that here. And at this time in history, Zeus, who was the god of the Greeks, was described as Zeus was, Zeus is, Zeus shall be. And this phrase was uttered by the priestesses at the oracle of Zeus at Dodona. And as Aune notes, quote, the setting connects Zeus with prophecy, since the tripartite prophecy formula is based on the 3 moments of past, present, and future, end quote. So again, if we take what Beale's noticed, what Beale did notice, and say that John is also, in addition to pointing out or drawing our attention to Exodus chapter 3, he's also using this as an apologetic, saying basically, hey Greeks, I know you guys think that Zeus is the one who reveals prophecy because his priestesses are the ones who use this same formula, but John is saying that's not the case. Zeus is not the source of prophecy, Yahweh is. And I wonder if John may have had Isaiah 41 and 46 in mind, because in Isaiah 41 verses 22 and 23, Yahweh basically calls out the gods and challenges them to tell the future. And in those verses, I'm going to read them. It says, let them draw near and foretell to us what it is that shall happen. What are the things of long ago? Tell us that we may reflect on them and know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to be in the future, that we may know that you are gods. Do something, good or evil, that will put us in awe and in fear. So that passage in Isaiah 41 is Yahweh calling out the gods, saying basically prophesy the future so that we can know that you know. But then when we get to Isaiah 46 verse 10, Yahweh says, at the beginning I declared the outcome, from of old things not yet done. So John, again, who is very familiar with the Old Testament and who is very familiar with Isaiah, and we see a lot of quotations, because he doesn't directly quote, but a lot of allusions to Isaiah throughout the book of Revelation, I just wonder if he was thinking about this passage when he's basically slapping at Zeus here. Again, by saying, hey, Yahweh challenged you all in the Old Testament to tell the future, and your pagan priestesses claim that you are the source of prophetic oracles. So go ahead and do that. But again, John's saying you can't because Yahweh is the source of prophecy. Michael Heiser also notices this, and he says, quote, what John is doing here by using this threefold phrase is in fact not just committing a grammatical error so that you go look and find Exodus 3:14. John wants people to see that, but he wants more. So he supplements it. It's not only the he who is, but he who was and who is to come. And when he adds those two elements, it's a swipe at Zeus. So now he's looking at he's looping the pagans in too, and anybody else in the Jewish community who might be familiar with how pagans looked at Zeus and how Zeus was set as a rival or better than Yahweh. So just this one little selection from Exodus 3:14 and then supplementing it a little bit, giving it a little more play, is actually theological telegraphing. It's significant, end quote. And again, what John's point is that it is Yahweh, not Zeus, who is the Most High Sovereign, and Yahweh, not Zeus, is the source of true prophecy. Now this phrase, this threefold phrase, was used not only for Zeus in the ancient world, but it was also used for the goddess. There was, according to the historian Plutarch, an inscription on the base of a statue of Athena, who was also known as Minerva, aka Isis. And this inscription on this statue of the goddess reads, quote, I am all that has been and is and shall be, and my robe no mortal has yet uncovered, end quote. Now, of course, the main point is to notice the first part of that statement, but it's interesting how that ends, my robe no mortal has yet uncovered. I just wonder if that's some kind of an allusion to Genesis 6, that the goddess is saying, kind of like, I have not slept with any mortal men or something. I'm not sure, but I just noticed that and thought that was interesting, and was just wondering if there is some kind of connection to that phrase to the Genesis 6 situation with the gods and all that. But the first part of the formula there is very reminiscent of the boasts of the woman who sets herself up against God. Again, the goddess or Mystery Babylon. And we see similar language in the Old Testament. Zephaniah 2:15 says, this is the exultant city that lived securely, that said in her heart, I am, and there is no one else. So that is very similar to the inscription on the statue of the goddess, I am all that has been. We'll see this also when we get to Revelation chapter 18, which is the Mystery Babylon chapter, and it says, she boasted in her heart, I am queen on my throne, I am no helpless widow, and I have no reason to mourn. Also again, Isaiah 47, verse 5, 8, and 10 says, sit in silence and go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called the mistress of kingdoms. Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. You felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray, and you said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. So we notice that the same thing over and over. The goddess, she said in her heart, I am, and there is no one else. Zephaniah 2:15. Again, she boasted in her heart, we'll see in Revelation 18:7. And the same thing again, you say in your heart, Isaiah 47:8. And then again in verse 10, you said in your heart. And it's the same boast, I am, and there is no one besides me. So this is Mystery Babylon language in the Old Testament. And as we've discussed before on the channel, Mystery Babylon has its biblical source in the Old Testament prophets. So the language of Mystery Babylon comes from the mouth of the goddess in pagan religion. So John has all of these things in mind when he uses this phrase, he who is and who was and who is still to come. Again, he's intending us to go look at Exodus 3:14 because it's the title for Yahweh that the Jews of the time were familiar with. I think it also is tied into the Targums, which points again to the deity of Christ, because John's theology talks about the Word that was made flesh, and the Word is God, and it's the Word who uses that threefold formula in Deuteronomy 32:39. And then again, he's also using it as an apologetic, or as a polemic against the pagan gods and goddesses. So there's a lot wrapped up in that phrase. It's a very important phrase, and again, it shows up multiple places in Revelation. So that's all we're going to do for right now. In our next study, we're going to analyze the 7 spirits who are before his throne. Try to identify who are they, because there's been a lot written, both now and in the early church, seeking to identify the meaning of that phrase. So for now, I want to thank you all for listening. If you're not subscribed, please do so. It helps the channel. If you are subscribed, be sure to like, share, comment, all that good stuff, as it does help the channel with the analytics. So until next time, God bless. I'll talk to you all very soon.